My marriage of 24 years was destroyed when I caught my wife with another man at a party. I was there, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and the safe environment I had built over decades. A universe of trust, of shared laughter, of memories that defined our union. That night, everything seemed ordinary, until my eyes caught something that would forever change the course of my life. The room was lit, music filled the air, and I saw her, laughing, talking, completely at ease. It wasn't the first time she had walked away to talk to someone. After all, we were part of that New York elite, where everyone knew everyone. But then, something in her eyes changed, something I had never seen before. The intimacy in his gaze, the way his fingers brushed his arm, a connection that I had only seen between the two of us. My heart raced, each beat bringing with it a flood of thoughts. Would it be possible? Could the one who was by my side for so long, the one I trusted with all my secrets, my fears, my dreams, be betraying me? Doubt gnawed at me inside, and every second that passed seemed like an eternity. Then, driven by an almost mortal curiosity, I began to follow his steps with my eyes, my body moving almost automatically. They walked away from the group, laughing and whispering, as if the world around them didn't exist. I followed them, trying to convince myself that it was all a misunderstanding. But then, hidden in the shadows of the party, I saw them. They were too close, their breaths intertwined, the whispers now turning into words that weren't meant to be heard. It was at that moment, with my heart in tatters, that the world came crashing down on me. Betrayal, that bitter word I always thought was reserved for others, for distant stories, was now my reality. But what could have been just an ordinary marital betrayal turned out to be even more devastating. That man, the one who destroyed my marriage with his touches and soft words, was not just any stranger. He was someone I did business with, someone I trusted professionally, someone whose power could crush more than just my heart. Questions kept coming into my mind: how could she do this to me? How did I never notice? And, most terrifying of all, what would he do with the information he now had? Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that this man never took a step without calculating all its consequences. Now the only thing left was to find out how far this betrayal would go, and if there was something in me that could somehow survive it. The truth was that my 24-year marriage was destroyed, but the consequences of this betrayal were just beginning to unfold. That night in New York seemed to be another in Richard and Emily Warren's never-ending social schedule. Married for 24 years, they were one of the best-known couples in the city's social and business circles. Richard, a successful real estate businessman, had always been proud of his trajectory built from nothing. With an enviable business acumen and an impeccable reputation, he had made his name synonymous with power and respect. Emily, on the other hand, was the embodiment of elegance and charisma. For years, she was the perfect hostess, the devoted wife and the loving mother of their 2 children, now adults and moving on with their own lives. She was the perfect balance to Richard's intense nature. While he took care of the business, she managed the house, took care of the children and shined at the social events they both frequently attended. The couple seemed to have it all: a beautiful house on the Upper East Side, professional success, successful children, and a marriage that, in everyone's eyes, was the definition of solid. However, behind the doors of the imposing mansion in which they lived, something had changed. Small cracks began to appear in the foundation they had built over more than 2 decades together. To Richard, these cracks were invisible, hidden by his blind dedication to his work and the unwavering trust he had always placed in Emily. Emily, in turn, felt increasingly suffocated by the predictable routine that her life had become. The parties, the charity events, the family gatherings, it all felt like a never-ending cycle that left her emotionally exhausted. For a long time, she managed to hide this feeling, maintaining the facade of a perfect wife, but little by little, something inside her began to awaken. A desire for freedom, to feel again the excitement that I hadn't felt in so long. It was during this phase of silent dissatisfaction that Emily met Victor Harrington, a man who immediately fascinated her. Victor was everything Richard wasn't: adventurous, carefree, and with a charm that he knew how to use masterfully. He was one of Richard's new business partners, running a fast-rising technology company. At 45 years old, Victor had the world at his feet and didn't worry about hiding it. His confident attitude and the sparkle in his eyes when he talked about his achievements quickly attracted Emily, who, without realizing it, began to get closer and closer to him. Victor, in turn, quickly noticed Emily's interest. As an experienced player, he knew exactly how to attract her, how to say the right words that would make her heart race, how to create situations where they were both alone, away from prying eyes. For him, Emily was an achievement like any other, a challenge to be overcome. He knew that, in addition to being beautiful and charming, she was the wife of one of the most influential men he knew. But for Victor, that only made the situation more exciting. Richard, always absorbed in his commitments, barely noticed the changes around him. Dinners at home became rarer, conversations shorter. Emily was increasingly distant, always with an excuse ready to avoid the moments together that were once sacred. And yet, Richard believed everything was fine. For him, the world was simple, business was going well, his marriage was stable, and nothing could interfere with the life he had built with so much effort. On that fateful night, everything seemed as it always had. The party at one of the city's most exclusive clubs was just another event on his agenda, an opportunity for Richard to strengthen his connections and for Emily to shine by his side. But Emily's glow was different, there was an air of uneasiness about her, something Richard noticed, albeit briefly. He attributed this to tiredness, the fast pace of the social life they led. She smiled, said everything was fine, and he, as usual, accepted the answer without question. The party continued its course, with lively conversations, laughter, and endless toasts. Richard moved around the room, talking to old friends and new contacts, while Emily retreated to a quieter corner, claiming to need a moment to herself. It was at that moment that Victor approached, with that captivating smile that always disarmed any resistance. They talked like old friends, but there was something more to their conversation, something they hid from the world around them. Emily couldn't avoid Victor's magnetism, and when he suggested they go outside for a moment to get some fresh air, she accepted without a second thought. It was an escape from the routine that suffocated her so much, a breach in the wall she had built over the years. Richard, on the other hand, continued immersed in his conversations, without realizing that, just a few meters away, something was about to change forever. When he finally noticed Emily's prolonged absence, an uneasiness began to grow in his chest. He circled the room, discreetly asking if anyone had seen her. But no one could say where she was. It was then that Richard decided to look for her, first around the hall, then in the gardens outside. And it was there, among the shadows of the night, that he saw it. Emily and Victor, side by side, closer than any couple of friends should be. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The world around him seemed to stop as he took in the scene before him, unable to believe what he was seeing. Every gesture, every smile exchanged between Emily and Victor, was like a stab in her chest. He wanted to believe that he was imagining things, that it was just a misunderstanding, but deep down, he knew that it wasn't. The distance between them seemed to disappear, and the closeness between his wife and Victor was impossible to ignore. That vision, so painfully real, was enough to make Richard realize that something much bigger than he could have imagined was happening. Betrayal was not just a distant possibility, but a cruel reality he would have to face. And as the weight of this new reality began to fall on him, Richard knew that nothing would be the same as before. What he didn't know, however, was that this betrayal would only be the beginning of a series of discoveries that would shake his life in ways he could never have predicted. After that devastating night, Richard felt his world slowly fall apart. The images of Emily and Victor, so close, so intimate, burned his mind like an indelible mark. In the days that followed, Richard's routine became a tangle of suspicions and doubts. That man, who had always prided himself on his mental clarity and his ability to control any situation, now found himself lost in a whirlwind of emotions that he couldn't fully understand. He tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but every interaction with Emily was marked by silent tension. She, in turn, acted as if nothing had changed, as if that moment he had witnessed was just a figment of his imagination. Emily continued to smile, maintaining the same routine, but there was something in her eyes that Richard couldn't decipher. He wanted to confront her, demand explanations, but every time he tried to start this conversation, he felt paralyzed by the fear of destroying what was left of their marriage. At the same time, Richard began to notice Victor's presence in places he hadn't noticed before. At corporate events, business meetings, and even casual encounters. It was as if Victor was always lurking, watching him, waiting for something. Richard knew he needed to be careful, but he couldn't help but feel a rising anger whenever he saw him. However, he was not yet ready to act. Something held him back, perhaps the fear of losing more than he had already lost. The weeks passed, and the tension between Richard and Emily became unbearable. Small arguments began to arise over trivial things, but they both knew that those were not the things that were really at stake. There was something much bigger, much more dangerous, buried beneath the surface of every word spoken, every prolonged silence. Richard, desperate to find answers, began investigating on his own. He reviewed his interactions with Emily, looking for clues that could indicate that relationship with Victor had started. He searched his mind for moments that could have gone unnoticed, trying to put together a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. Richard's distrust led him to take actions he never imagined he was capable of. He began to follow Emily's footsteps discreetly, observing her movements, her exits, her meetings. He became a shadow, always present but never seen. And the more he watched, the more he felt something was deeply wrong. Emily seemed to be increasingly distant, not just physically, but emotionally. Her gaze was lost, her answers were short, as if her mind was somewhere else. And, indeed, it was. It was during one of these discreet investigations that Richard realized the extent of the web of lies in which he was involved. One afternoon, after following Emily to a cafe in the city center, he saw her talking to Victor again. There was no doubt now, the relationship between them was more than just flirting. The way she touched his hand, the way her eyes sparkled in his presence, everything indicated that the bond between them was deep and strong. Richard felt anger bubbling up inside him, but he still held himself back. He needed more than assumptions, he needed proof, something that left no room for excuses or denials. It was then that Richard made a decision that would change everything. He hired a private investigator to follow Emily and Victor, to document their every move, their every encounter. The evidence began to accumulate, each photo, each report sent by the investigator was like a new stab in his already wounded heart. He had all the evidence he needed, but he still didn't know what to do with it. Facing Emily would mean giving up what was left of his comfortable life, it would mean admitting that everything he had fought for was over. At the same time, Richard began to realize that the relationship between Victor and Emily was not just personal, but was also affecting his business. Victor was getting dangerously close to his company, attending meetings he had previously had no interest in, proposing deals that Richard knew were risky. His presence became increasingly intrusive, and Richard began to feel like he was losing control of his own life, both personally and professionally. The days became a constant struggle to maintain composure. Richard could barely sleep, his mind always occupied with the images of Emily and Victor together, with the veiled threats that this brought into his life. He began to withdraw from people, isolating himself in his office, where he spent hours reviewing contracts, emails, anything that could distract him from the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. But nothing could ease the pain and anger that was growing inside him. Emily, on the other hand, seemed increasingly distant. She also noticed the changes in Richard, his emotional absence, the way he isolated himself. But instead of trying to understand or confront the situation, she delved even deeper into her relationship with Victor. For her, Victor was an escape, a way to feel again the passion and excitement that had long since disappeared from her marriage. Every encounter with him was like a breath of new life, something she wasn't willing to give up, even if it meant destroying everything she had built with Richard. As the tension grew, Richard knew something needed to be done. He could not continue living in that anguish, in that state of uncertainty and pain. But he still didn't know how to act. Confronting Emily would mean unmasking everything, destroying the last illusions he still had about his marriage. But remaining silent was not an option either. With each passing day, he felt like he was losing a piece of himself, that betrayal was eating away at his soul. And then, one sleepless night, as he reviewed for the 1,000th time the evidence that the investigator had sent him, Richard realized that he could no longer delay the inevitable. He needed to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. And in doing so, he knew he was about to unearth even darker secrets, secrets that could not only destroy his marriage, but also his career, his reputation, his very identity. Richard was about to make the most difficult decision of his life, and he knew that whatever path he chose, the consequences would be devastating. What he still didn't know was how far this web of lies and betrayal would take him, and how much he would have to sacrifice to survive what was to come. The air was thick in the living room of the Warrens' stately mansion. The clock showed just after 10 at night, but the environment seemed frozen in time. Richard sat in the leather armchair that had so often been his refuge after long days of work. His eyes, normally so penetrating and analytical, were now tired, lost in a void that stretched beyond the walls of his home. He had spent the entire day reviewing every detail of what he knew, pondering every move he would make from then on. The decision to confront Emily and Victor had been made, but the execution of that plan, of bringing to light everything that had been discovered, left him with an unbearable weight. Emily arrived shortly after, carrying with her a mix of tranquility and distance. She had been out all day, citing social engagements that, to Richard, now sounded like empty excuses. She noticed Richard's rigid posture, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see, and the tension in the room seemed palpable. Without saying a word, she placed her bag on the side table and went towards the bar, where she began to prepare a drink. Richard watched her every move as if he were memorizing the last moments of a life that was about to change forever. He waited until she was finished, until she settled on the couch across from him. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Emily finally looked up, meeting Richard's gaze. The discomfort was evident, and she knew something was coming. "We need to talk," Richard finally broke the silence, his voice firm but with a note of weariness that she couldn't ignore. Emily, still maintaining a calm facade, just nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I know what's going on," he continued, bluntly. Emily remained silent, her heart racing as she tried to maintain her composure. "I know about you and Victor." For a moment, the world seemed to stop for Emily. Those words, so direct and cruel, echoed in his mind like an unexpected blow. She wanted to react, deny it, make up some excuse, but Richard's expression stopped her. He knew. There was no turning back. "Richard." She began, but her voice trailed off. The words she had rehearsed so many times, in case she needed to use them, disappeared from her mind. She knew there was no escaping that reality. "How long?" Richard asked, cutting the space she was trying to create between them. The pain in his voice was undeniable, a mix of anger and disappointment that she had never seen in him before. Emily lowered her head, unable to meet Richard's penetrating gaze. "A few months," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. She knew the answer would be devastating, but lying now would only prolong the inevitable. Richard took a deep breath, as if he was trying to process the information, even though he already knew the answer before he asked. He felt a wave of nausea rise, but he forced himself to keep control. He needed to understand what had driven his wife to cheat on him, to look to another man for something he believed he had given her over the years. Why? The question escaped his lips before he could stop himself. It was a simple question, but one filled with layers of pain and confusion. He couldn't understand how, after so long together, Emily could choose Victor. Emily hesitated, knowing that any answer she gave would only serve to deepen the rift between them. "I don't know. There's no single reason," she replied, her voice shaking. I felt lost, alone. And then he showed up, saying all the right things, making me feel alive again. Richard closed his eyes, trying to absorb those words. He felt torn between the desire to scream, to demand more answers, and the painful realization that he might never fully understand what was going on in Emily's mind. But there was something more, something that still needed to be clarified, something that had tormented him since the beginning. "Victor," he began, voice colder now, he approached me, my business, our life, as if he were playing a game. "Did you know that? Did you know what he was doing?" Emily looked up, now confused. "What do you mean?" "He's manipulating me, Emily. He used you to get to me, to get access to information, to contracts. Do you really believe he was only interested in you as a woman? Or were you just a pawn in his game?" Richard's words hit Emily like a physical blow. She had felt Victor's affection, his interest, but the idea of being used as a tool in a power play left her bewildered. "No, Richard, that can't be true," she tried to argue, but her voice betrayed the uncertainty that now dominated her mind. "I have proof," Richard stated, handing her an envelope. Inside, there were photos, records of meetings and documents that revealed Victor's true purpose. "He was trying to take control, Emily. And you let yourself get involved, not only destroying our marriage, but putting everything I've built at risk." Emily trembled as she flipped through the proofs, each page revealing a new betrayal, a new level of deception she hadn't realized. The reality of her situation came crashing down on her with an unbearable weight. Everything she had believed in, all the emotions she had felt for Victor, now seemed distant, almost unreal. I didn't know," she murmured, her voice cracking with guilt and shame. She realized that she had been naive, that she had let herself be carried away by an illusion. But the damage was already done, and there was no undoing the choices she had made. "He's going to pay for this," Richard stated, his voice now filled with cold determination. "And you, Emily, will have to decide if you're going to stay by his side or if you're going to try to save what's left of our lives." Emily knew that the choice she had to make was the hardest of her life. She had fallen in love with Victor, or at least what he represented, but now she saw what was really at stake. Victor's betrayal was not just a betrayal of Richard, but also of her, of the feelings she had harbored for him. And as she tried to find the right words, a new understanding began to dawn within her. Hours passed in tense silence after the revelation. Richard remained motionless, his thoughts alternating between the anger and pain that consumed him. Emily, for her part, felt entangled in a web of regret and doubt. The reality of Victor's actions finally settled in his mind, and what had once seemed like an emotional escape now turned out to be a nightmare. The man she had risked everything for was not who she thought he was, and the realization crushed her. "He lied to me," Emily whispered, more to herself than to Richard. His voice was fragile, as if any word could crumble what little he had left of his strength. "He used me, and I was blind." Richard watched her every reaction, every expression that crossed Emily's face. Part of him wanted to believe that she too had been deceived, that the love they once shared could still be saved. But another part, the one overcome by pain, whispered that it was too late, that the wounds were too deep to be healed. "You must choose, Emily," he finally said, his voice firm but without the coldness it had been before. "You can continue with Victor, but know that he won't hesitate to use you again. Or you can come back to me, try to rebuild what we still have. But that's your decision, and I won't pressure you." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with tears that she was fighting to hold back. She knew Richard was right. Victor was an illusion, a lie she had embraced in a moment of weakness. But she also knew that returning to Richard meant facing the full consequences of her actions, meant rebuilding a marriage she had nearly destroyed. The days that followed were a blur for both of them. Emily distanced herself from Victor, canceling dates, avoiding his calls. The safety mask she wore at social events began to disintegrate, revealing a woman consumed by guilt and uncertainty. She still loved Richard, but the damage she had caused seemed irreparable. Every time she looked at him, she saw a reflection of her own betrayal, and it tore her apart inside. Victor, in turn, realized that something had changed. He was no fool, and Emily's departure made him uneasy. For weeks, he tried to get in touch, using every means possible to reach her, but the answers were always vague, distant. He knew he was losing control of the situation, and it made him furious. The plan he had laid out so precisely was now falling apart, and he needed to act before it was too late. It was one night, during a business event, that things finally came to a head. Victor was present, circulating among the guests, always the center of attention, always the man of power that everyone admired. Richard, however, knew what was behind that confident smile. And at that moment, with all the evidence in hand and with Emily's decision hanging in the air, he decided it was time to confront Victor once and for all. The room was crowded, and the bright lights hid the tension building between the two men. Richard approached Victor with firm steps, his gaze fixed and determined. When they finally met, Victor realized that there was no more room for games. Richard knew everything. "We need to talk," Richard said in a tone that left no room for refusal. Victor, ever the master of dissimulation, just smiled and waved them away from the crowd. They headed to a more secluded corner, where the words wouldn't be heard by others. "So, Richard," Victor began, his voice filled with false cordiality, "what can I do for you?" "Spare me your lies, Victor," Richard snapped, contempt evident in his voice. "I know what you did. I know everything." Victor's smile faltered for a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "Everything? What are you referring to, exactly?" "I'm talking about how you used Emily to infiltrate my business, to manipulate situations to your advantage. I'm talking about how you took advantage of our trust, our marriage, to get what you wanted." Victor didn't deny it. He knew it would be useless. "Business is business, Richard," he said, with a shrug. "You should know that better than anyone." Richard's anger increased with each of Victor's words. "You played with people's lives, Victor. It's not just about business. You destroyed my marriage." Victor laughed, a cold sound devoid of any humor. "Richard, you didn't need my help to destroy your marriage. You did it alone, with your negligence, your obsession with work. I just took the opportunity." Those words cut deep. Richard knew there was a bitter truth to them, but he also knew that Victor was just trying to turn the tide. "That doesn't change the fact that you will pay for what you did," he said firmly. "I have proof, and I will not hesitate to use it." Victor narrowed his eyes, assessing the situation. He wasn't used to being challenged, and the fact that Richard was willing to confront him bothered him more than he cared to admit. "Evidence," he repeated, slowly. "What exactly do you intend to do with this evidence, Richard? Report me? And how do you think this will reflect on you and your precious company?" Richard knew Victor was trying to intimidate him, but his mind was already made up. "I'm prepared to face the consequences." "But you, Victor, are you prepared to lose everything?" The tension between the two men was palpable. They faced each other, two opponents in a battle where they both had a lot to lose. But while Richard was motivated by justice and the desire to protect what was left of his life, Victor was guided by pure personal interest. And that made all the difference. Emily watched from afar, seeing the two men who had shaped her life over the past few months now in direct confrontation. She knew she needed to make a decision, that she could no longer delay the inevitable. And in that moment, when she saw Richard's face, when she saw the pain and determination he carried, she knew what she needed to do. Richard and Victor continued to face each other, but they both knew that that battle would not be decided there, in that room. There would be consequences for both, but the end result was yet to come. After the confrontation with Victor, Richard felt exhausted, as if every word exchanged had drained his strength. However, he knew that that battle was not over yet. He returned home alone, leaving the party behind, not caring what people might think. As he drove through the nearly deserted streets, his mind raced with the implications of what was to come. He was determined to expose Victor, but he knew it meant facing a moral dilemma that tormented him deeply. Emily was waiting for him at home. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the door, awaiting his arrival as if her life depended on it. When Richard entered the room, she felt a chill run down her spine. The expression on his face was a mix of pain and determination, and she knew there was no more room for half-truths or excuses. "He admitted everything, didn't he?" Emily asked, even though she already knew the answer. Richard just nodded, fatigue weighing on his shoulders. "I need to know, Emily," he began, sitting down next to her, "if you were aware of everything, from the beginning. If you knew you were being used as a pawn in Victor's game." Emily sighed, feeling the weight of that question. "Not at first," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I really believed that, he cared about me. That what we had was real. But then, when things started to mix up, the business and the rest, I realized there was something more. Only I was so involved, so confused, that I didn't know how to get out of it. And also, Richard, I was angry at you, at us, at what our marriage had become." Richard heard those words with a heavy heart. He knew that part of what Emily said was true, that he himself had contributed to the distance between them, but still, the pain of being betrayed by two people he considered close was unbearable. "I can't forgive what you did, Emily," he said finally, his voice firm but with a deep sadness. "But I don't want to destroy your life, just as I don't want to destroy mine. What I do to Victor will affect you too, and I need you to understand that. If I go through with this, the consequences will be devastating, for all of us." Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She knew Richard was right. Reporting Victor meant exposing everything, including her participation in that story. It meant not only the destruction of the empire Richard had built, but also the destruction of the life she knew. However, leaving everything as it was meant allowing Victor to get away with it, allowing him to continue manipulating and destroying other lives. "So what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Richard didn't respond right away. He knew that any decision he made from that moment on would be a point of no return. If he chose to expose Victor, he would risk everything, including the chance of a possible reconciliation with Emily. If he chose to remain silent, he would be betraying his own principles, allowing injustice to prevail. "I don't know," he finally admitted, the honesty in his words reflecting the complexity of his situation. "But what I know is that I can't go on like this, with this pain, this anger consuming me. Something needs to be done, and we need to decide together, even if our marriage is destroyed." Emily looked at him, surprised that he still included her in the decision, even after everything. "You still care, don't you?" she asked, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Richard sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. "I care about the truth, Emily. And despite everything, a part of me still cares about you. I just don't know if that's enough to save us." The moral dilemma they faced was overwhelming. Reporting Victor meant doing the right thing, but at the cost of his own destruction. Maintaining silence meant protecting themselves, but at the cost of their integrity and, possibly, other lives. They were stuck at a crossroads, where whatever path they chose would bring suffering and loss. Emily knew that the final decision was in Richard's hands. He was the one who held the power, who had the evidence, and who would suffer the consequences most directly. But at the same time, she couldn't deny that she still had feelings for him, that she still wanted, in some way, to rebuild what they had lost. "If we decide to go through with this," she said finally, "we need to be prepared for the worst. To lose everything. But if we don't, I don't think we can ever forgive ourselves for letting Victor get away with it." Richard looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. He knew Emily was right, but the uncertainty still paralyzed him. It wasn't just about revenge or justice, it was about what would be left of them, of who they would become after all this. But at the same time, taking no action seemed impossible. "I'm going to make a decision," he said finally, his voice full of resolution. "But you need to be with me, Emily. If we go to war, we go together. If we decide to keep silent, it will be because we both agree it's the best thing to do." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. The decision was coming, and she knew that no matter what they chose, their lives would never be the same. Victor's shadow loomed over them, a constant threat that needed to be faced. But, together or apart, they would have to live with the consequences of their choices. And in that moment, as the night progressed and the silence between them grew deeper, they both knew that the next step would be decisive, both for the future of their marriage and for their own souls. The silence that morning was almost deafening. Richard and Emily were on opposite sides of the dinner table, their hands clasped instinctively but without the familiarity they had before. They both knew that day would mark the end of something that began more than 2 decades ago. Richard had spent the night awake, pondering the decision he needed to make. He reviewed all the possibilities, all the paths they could take, but deep down he knew there was only one choice to be made. When the clock struck 9, Richard finally stood up, feeling the weight of every movement. Emily watched him in silence, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. She knew that Richard had come to a conclusion, and although she feared what was to come, she also knew that there was no more room for regrets or second chances. "I've made my decision," Richard said, his voice low but firm. He had rehearsed those words countless times in his mind, but saying them out loud made them more real, more definitive. "I'm not going to let Victor get away with it." Emily swallowed hard, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of her felt relieved, knowing that Victor would finally face the consequences of his actions. But another part was terrified of what this would mean for them, for the life they had built, even if it was now in ruins. "I'm going to expose everything," Richard continued, without looking away from her. "The dirty dealings, the manipulations, what he did to you, to our family. But I know it will cost us dearly. And I'm not just talking financially." Emily knew he was right. The scandal that was about to explode would devastate their lives in unimaginable ways. Friends would drift away, business partners would avoid them, and their privacy would be destroyed. However, she also knew that this was the only way to find some kind of redemption, no matter how painful it was. "I'm with you," she replied, voice shaky but determined. "I will do whatever is necessary." At that moment, something changed between them. It wasn't the love they once shared, but a kind of complicity, an understanding that, despite everything, they were still partners, still together in this. The following weeks were a whirlwind of events. Richard moved the pieces with precision, using all the evidence he had accumulated against Victor. He knew the battle would be fierce, that Victor would not retreat without a fight. But Richard was prepared for this. He used his power and influence to ensure that information got into the right hands, that justice was served, even if it meant exposing his own vulnerabilities. When the scandal finally came to light, it was like an explosion. Victor was publicly unmasked, his shady dealings and manipulations came to light. He tried to defend himself, used every resource he had to hush up the situation, but Richard had been meticulous in his preparation. There was no way to escape. Victor was arrested, accused of fraud, manipulation and other financial crimes. His reputation was destroyed, and with it, his empire. But for Richard and Emily, victory had a bitter taste. They had destroyed Victor, but they had also destroyed part of themselves in the process. The media pounced on the scandal voraciously, and before long, the Warrens were the center of attention. The revelations about Emily's affair with Victor also became public, and the moral judgment was relentless. Emily found herself isolated, removed from the social circle that once revered her. Richard, although respected for his courage in exposing Victor, also became a tragic figure, a man who had sacrificed everything in the name of truth. Over time, Richard and Emily realized that despite facing Victor together, their marriage was irretrievably broken. The trust that once existed between them could not be restored. They then decided to go their separate ways, each trying to find some kind of peace amid the chaos that their lives had become. Richard, with his name cleared, turned to a more private life. He knew he could never rebuild the empire he once owned, but he was at peace with that. He had done what was right, he had maintained his integrity, and that, in the end, was what mattered most to him. Emily, on the other hand, set out in search of a new identity, far from the scandals and memories that haunted her. She knew she could never erase what she had done, but she was determined to find a way to move on, to rebuild her life somehow. And so, the story of Richard and Emily Warren came to an end. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a fair ending, where choices had consequences, and where the truth, however painful it was, prevailed. They learned that betrayal leaves deep scars, and that sometimes the only way to move forward is to accept the wounds and leave the past behind. In the end, both found a way to start over, albeit in different ways. And while the ghosts of their choices followed them, there was also a feeling of relief, that the worst was over, and that the future, uncertain and full of challenges, was now in their hands.